Hello, my name is Benjamin Tedesco, and I'll be presenting to you today Hunting in the Depths, the need for a strategic threat detection model. This has been the result of over a decade's worth of security experience in the fields of threat detection, digital forensics, incident response, and malware analysis. That has all culminated in this project, which was actually my master's thesis at Penn State University that I presented in 2018. The agenda today has four phases. Number one, I'm going to give you a brief overview as to who I am and the direction of my research. Next, I will provide a fairly detailed overview of threat hunting as well as various security concepts that are relevant to our study. Next, I will provide you with my research. So this will cover my formal research methodology as well as the data that I've discovered. And lastly, we will cover my findings as well as recommended best practices for improving threat hunting operations. First, my introduction. All right, so who am I? Well, I've been at Carbon Black now for 5 years. Prior to that, I was at Lockheed Martin for 5 years as a developer. And then I was also at Booz Allen after my time at Lockheed, where I served as an incident response and threat hunting lead. Now, during my tenure at Carbon Black, I serve as a security strategist as well as lead consultant, where I've been able to primarily focus on building out our advanced consulting practice. Given that my specialty is in incident response and forensics, I've been able to build out this collection of service offerings, largely surrounding Carbon Black Defense and Carbon Black Response, where we're able to actually go on site and mentor our customers in best practices surrounding incident response and threat hunting using these products. Additionally, in 2018, I was able to obtain my master's degree from Penn State. I was able to get this degree in information security and forensics with a focus on the Department of Homeland Security. As I mentioned actually in the introduction, this presentation that I'll be giving today is the culmination of my master's thesis. Two other side hobbies that I have: I love cooking, and I'm currently building my own Italian wood fire brick pizza oven in my backyard. And I also love taking pictures with my drones. Actually, on the right, you can see a few pictures I've taken on a recent trip to Norway. I went up to a small fishing village up in the north called Lofoten, and you can see some of the pictures I took. One was on a hike, the other one is of the midnight sun. Over the past decade, as I've been kind of mulling over the ideas that led to this thesis, uh, a quote came to mind that I felt adequately provides a perspective as to what I'll be presenting today. It's one by Mark Twain, and it simply states, "There's no such thing as a new idea. It is impossible. We simply take a lot of old ideas and put them in a sort of mental kaleidoscope. We then give them a turn and make new and curious combinations. We keep on turning and making new combinations indefinitely, but they are the same old pieces of colored glass that have been in use through all ages." And I think I like this quote for a number of different reasons. Number one, it reminds me of threat hunting, right? You're taking this data, you're twisting, manipulating, and you have the same data you might have looked at 100 different times, but you're looking at it, trying to find that different way to look at it to maybe reveal another potential indicator of compromise. Uh, the other reason I like this quote is that what I'll be presenting today are what I believe mostly fundamental concepts related to threat hunting. However, I think I have a unique take on it that allows us to take threat hunting and mature it to that next level. And I'm excited to show you what I've discovered. Bottom line up front, what is my research all about? Well, what I've discovered is that by aligning threat hunting operations to a strategic model, such as a kill chain, one can achieve increased detection awareness up to 700%. In the next several slides, I'll be showing you how I've arrived at this conclusion. First, I think it's important for us to review some necessary background surrounding the need for threat hunting, what it is, as well as other relevant security concepts that play a big part in this research project. Reliance on a traditional IDS or IPS to secure your environment is futile. While it might be more intuitive now, many were caught by surprise and even alarmed when the statement was made in 2014 that antivirus is dead. Even more surprisingly, however, was who made this statement: the Senior Vice President of Symantec Information Security. In 2017, it was further reported on NPR that attackers are now getting faster, more prevalent, and have access to even better tools, even top secret cyber weapons that were previously only accessible to nation state actors. We only need to look to the NSA hacks that occurred over the past year, where now we have very sophisticated attack vectors being publicly available. We can look at Eternal Blue, Double Pulsar, and the other NSA tools that are now leaked on the open source, ready for anyone to use. As we look across the cyber landscape, we can conclude that intrusions are on the rise and attackers are definitely getting smarter. In 2016, Verizon released their data breach report, and they say that the detection deficit is getting worse. Essentially, the detection deficit is the time to compromise versus the time to detection. In 2017, cyber attacks increased by 223% as reported by F-Secure. And then Carbon Black reported that every computer protected by Carbon Black is being targeted on average of 3 times a month. At the beginning of 2017, this number was less than 1 attack per month, a growth rate of over 328%. I want to provide you with one more quote that really gets to the heart of the matter. This was first published in Gartner in 2014, and they state that advanced targeted attacks are easily bypassing traditional firewalls and signature-based prevention mechanisms. All organizations should now assume that they are in a state of continuous compromise. However, organizations have deluded themselves into believing that 100% prevention is possible, and they've become overly reliant on blocking-based and signature-based mechanisms for prevention. As a result, most enterprises have limited capabilities to detect and respond to breaches when they inevitably occur, resulting in longer dwell times and increased damage. So with these quotes in mind, let's discuss the weaknesses and vulnerabilities associated with relying on an IDS for enterprise security. Well, number one, an IDS itself is a logical target for attack. In 2012, a study came out actually discussing different ways to either disable or force an IDS to produce disinformation. So one of these ideas is that if you take out the shepherd, the sheep are left vulnerable. Secondly, IDSs are designed to detect known attack vectors. So, by definition, when presented with an unknown attack vector, their behavior is, let's say, erratic at best. So they have a difficulty in identifying new attacks. Actually, a study came out in 2014 stating that Snort had only an 8% detection rate when it came to 0 days. Lastly, these IDSs require a library of signatures or a set of predefined patterns for them to know what to attack. And as attackers continue to evolve in their TTPs, these signatures must also be updated in the IDS. Right, and as we all know, especially advanced actors are continually evolving in their techniques. So at the bottom, I do have this quote: any security measure taken may or may not be effective depending upon how far the actor has already evolved. So I want to conclude with a quote from Dr. Eric Cole from the SANS Institute. In 2016, 3 absolute facts are relevant when it comes to security. Number 1, an organization cannot prevent all attacks. Number 2, an organization's network is going to be compromised. And 3, 100% security does not exist. This means that adversaries will breach your organization's protection if they haven't already. Many now look to threat hunting as an answer to this rather dire predicament that we're in. In 2017, Mr. Shackelford from the SANS Institute conducted a study across the industry in which he asked, do you still need to improve your threat hunting tools and capabilities? Well, as we can see at the table below, almost 90% of those who responded stated the need for improvement in these capabilities. 6.5% stated that they were happy where they were, and 5.5% didn't respond at all. This then begs the question, how can we do threat hunting better? A study of threat hunting and detection. Well, before we answer the question of how we can threat hunt better, let's first define our terms. What is threat hunting? Well, Dr. Eric Cole in 2017 defined threat hunting as the act of aggressively tracking and eliminating cyber adversaries from your network as early as possible. With this definition in mind, let's take it a step further. Well, we know what threat hunting is, but how do you do it? Practically, what are the steps that you would take? Well, in 2017, Dr. Cole again has an answer for us. He states that results indicate 86% of respondents believe that anomalies are the biggest trigger when driving threat hunting, as opposed to 41% who hunted on hypothesis, while 51% of the respondents say hunts are also triggered by third-party sources, including threat intelligence. What I take this to mean is that there is one primary way to accomplish threat hunting, and that is through statistical analysis, namely anomaly detection. Now, this can apply itself to the two practical ways that Dr. Cole mentioned in his quote. Number one, he mentioned searching with using threat intelligence. I've called this hunting with arbitrary indicators of compromise, or ad hoc searching, or if you want to put it more casually, the shotgun approach. Or number two, you can leverage statistical analysis in what I call focused threat operations, or this would be depth-first searching with specialized resources, or again, as I term it, detection choke points. So let's talk a little bit about what statistical analysis is and how it can be used in threat hunting. Well, statistical analysis typically refers to the analysis of a set of data over a series of time. Now, the goal here is to determine what a normalized baseline of activity is, and then to be able to tag that as noise and then eliminate it out. What you're then left with are the anomalous data elements, which then can be tagged as a signal. This process of filtering out noise to then amplify signal is what we'd call anomaly detection. This process of anomaly detection I've affectionately termed ignore normal, find evil. As you can see in the funnel illustration below, we can see that initially we have an entire set of data that we pass through this funnel. And first we try to determine what this normalized baseline of data looks like. And then we filter out that baseline, and what we're left with is the anomalous activity that we can then identify and begin to tag and look for statistical deviations. So what are some of the benefits of using statistical analysis for threat hunting? Well, number one, we're no longer constrained by signatures or indicators when it comes to detecting unusual or suspicious activity. Number two, this provides us with a very flexible and dynamic model that can adjust as the organization adapts. And number three, we have the ability then to detect new, previously unknown attacks, given that we are no longer looking for only known indicators. Now, as far as difficulties go, well, initially, especially, there's a high rate of false positives that need to be tuned out as we're trying to determine what this initial baseline of normalized noise is in the environment. And secondly, there is continual maintenance that's required. As the baseline evolves, we also need to make sure that our noise filtering also evolves to ensure that we are only tagging anomalous events. Now that we've covered the concept of statistical analysis at a high level, let's talk specifically about how this can be applied to threat hunting using third-party threat intelligence. So in 2017, Dr. Cole stated that 51% of organizations use threat intelligence as a key trigger when it comes to threat hunting and detection. Also in 2017, Dave Shackelford of the SANS Institute conducted a study in which he was able to derive some information pertaining to just where these sources of intelligence were coming from that were being consumed in the industry. Well, 73% of those who responded stated that they collected threat intelligence from various computer emergency response teams or readiness teams, CERTs, and from information sharing and analysis centers, ISACs. Additionally, 54% of those collected intelligence from internal sources, 52% from vendor feeds, and 50% from open source or public feeds. I wanted to pause here and take a moment to discuss the impact of internal threat intelligence. On the previous slide, it was stated that only 54% of organizations actually leverage this valuable asset. In 2011, the SANS Institute released their SANS Incident Handlers Handbook. In here, they lay out the SANS pickerel incident response methodology. Here's what it says about that. The most critical phase after the others is the lessons learned. The purpose of this phase is to complete any documentation that was not done during the incident, as well as any additional documentation that may be beneficial in future incidents. The overall goal is to learn from the incidents that occurred within an organization to improve the team's performance and provide reference materials in the event of a similar incident. So what we're saying here is that the most important phase of an incident is actually the post-op debrief, in which you're able to then collect the various indicators that were leveraged by the attack and input them back into your controls to ensure that future breaches that leverage similar TTPs will be detected and prevented. I would be remiss if I didn't also discuss the value of third-party threat intelligence. Now, a study came out in 2016, which I found was quite interesting. In this study, 45 different threat intelligence providers were analyzed for comprehensivity, timeliness, and the robustness of indicators. In this table below, it depicts an overview of what was discovered, and it's quite interesting. So when it comes to the comprehensivity of the indicators, this is the first column in this table right here. You can see that the leader actually has 57% of all indicators covered in that particular data set that was provided by the 45 different feeds. About half. Now, when it comes to timeliness, that's the third column. It's quite interesting to see again that the leader of this, the particular feed that was the most rapid in disseminating indicators, was only timely 59% of the time. So again, close to half the time. Now, the last column right here is one that I find quite interesting. So this is the robustness or the fidelity of the indicators. And it's interesting. These numbers are all over the map. There's quite a wide variance. You can see one that is 29% of the time accurate versus Palo Alto that has accuracy 87%. Now, that 87% robustness is actually quite impressive. However, when you go back to the third column right here, you notice that while Palo Alto has very high quality intelligence, it's only timely 15% of the time, which makes sense that high quality intelligence takes time, but at the same time, you need to weigh then the value of time versus fidelity. Ultimately, what this study concluded is that it is quite risky to simply rely on a single source of threat intelligence, as there are a number of different ways to calculate or determine the value of these feeds. However, one should make sure to consider comprehensivity, timeliness of feeds being updated, as well as the fidelity or robustness of the data being provided. Now, despite all that was said regarding the extreme variance when it comes to the comprehensivity, speed of delivery, as well as robustness of indicators, one thing needs to be emphatically stated. Threat intelligence is absolutely impactful. In 2017, Dave Shackelford made the following observations. He states that 17.5% of those who incorporated threat intelligence in detection and hunt operations saw an increase of 11 to 25% in detection rates. Further, another 17.5% saw that actually rate increase from 26 to 50%. Furthermore, almost 20% of those surveyed who incorporated threat intelligence into their hunting and detection operations saw increased detection rates of 51 to 75%. It is absolutely the fact that threat intelligence does impact threat hunting operations. Ultimately, the worth of a threat intelligence feed is all about the indicators. As we all know, once an attacker has been discovered and their TTPs are published on the open source, they'll very rapidly change their tactics to avoid detection. In the study from 2016, it was stated that indicators receiving intense reports tend to be short-lived and typically disappear after only 1 month. Now, in this discussion of indicators, I'd be remiss not to mention David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain. In 2014, David Bianco created this model of a pyramid to express the value of certain indicators and align them against adversary difficulty when attempting to adapt and evade detections based upon these indicator types. As David states, not all indicators are created equal, though, and some of them are far more valuable than others. At the bottom of the Pyramid of Pain, David begins with a simplistic hash value. So these would be just static indicators used for matching various files on disk. Again, David states that it's relatively trivial for an adversary then to recompile their code, change a bit, and modify thus the hash and evade detection this way. The next level is IP addresses. Again, these are quite easy for the attacker to change. Same with domain names. Again, relatively simple for the attacker to simply modify the command and control server that's being used in the attack. Now, as you move up this pyramid of pain, the level of annoyance becomes much more challenging for the attackers as you now are beginning to look for host-based and network-based artifacts. As you begin to align your tools and detections, align your detections for the adversary's tools and eventually for adversary behavior, this is where it becomes much more difficult and much more effort intensive for the adversary to begin to evade detection at these levels. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is force an escalation of effort that makes it too expensive or not worth it for the attacker to continue their attempt to breach the security in an environment. At the end of the day, hunting with arbitrary indicators of compromise is truly just ad hoc searching with a very large data set. I've termed this the shotgun approach, as there's no formal process to measure or validate the effectiveness of this detection mechanism. The rationale behind this strategy truly is, well, the larger the volume of indicators available for detection, the better the chance one has to stumble across malicious activity. Now, the crux of the matter is that you never truly know if you have, and I'm using air quotes here, enough indicators available to ensure adequate detection. In summary, hunting with bulk threat intelligence absolutely does provide value to those hunting with this capacity. This value largely lies in the sheer volume of indicators that are available to be leveraged for detection as well as prevention. Now, another value is the ability to then collaborate and analyze trends of detections that are occurring from others that are leveraging these same data sets. So this can be very useful if you are, for instance, trying to track campaigns or the different ways in which an attacker is evolving in their TTPs throughout a certain population of users. Additionally, these data sets are often formatted in a way that they can be ingested into various automated controls so that we can rapidly detect or actually prevent certain breaches that match these signatures. Now, obviously, there are also difficulties associated with this approach as well. As we mentioned, we can only we can only detect known attack vectors. These data sets, as we mentioned, are also disparate and they have varying degrees of comprehensivity, timeliness, as well as fidelity. Additionally, when attempting to automate the detections related to this threat intelligence, you'll often need to go ahead and wrap these feeds with some code in order to ensure that the data is formatted to be appropriately ingested into the controls in your environments. As we mentioned before, attackers very rapidly update their TTPs once they have been detected. And so there's also the need to continually update and validate the indicators that are in your environment. And this might have a cost associated to it if you need to have a subscription to some of these threat intelligence sources. Lastly, it is very difficult to measure for detection gaps. Again, we talked about you don't know what you don't know, but in this case, we're talking about a way in which that we can audit to determine if your controls are comprehensive enough in their detection or if there are gaps in your indicator sets. Now that we've covered the first means of threat hunting, namely threat hunting through the use of threat intelligence, I want to turn the page and discuss the second means by which threat hunting is currently being implemented in an industry today. That is through focused threat operations, or depth-first searching. Essentially what we're looking for here are individuals with a very high level of skill and a high level of knowledge of the environment. And this can come in a number of different verticals. So maybe we have an administrator who has extreme expertise in Active Directory, or someone that has a high understanding of how SQL databases work, and they can audit the logs and know exactly where there might be malicious activity occurring. Maybe you have someone that is, a Linux guru, or someone that is fantastic at analyzing network traffic. They just live and breathe this stuff, and they're able to very quickly identify unusual behavior because they're so aware of what normal and benign and legitimate activity looks like. Furthermore, in 2017, Dr. Cole was able to identify the top 7 most scrutinized areas in the environment. These include IDS and IPS feeds, access control and authentication logs, DNS, network traffic flow, endpoint security feeds, SIM alerts, and threat intelligence. As we discuss focused threat operations and depth-first searching, I like to bring up the concept of detection choke points here. What we have are exceptionally high-quality indicators crafted by users with an extreme knowledge of the environment or those with a very high level of skill pertaining to certain technologies. Now, what this does is it actually can tip the scales back in the defender's favor. The reason for this is that the defender will typically have a better knowledge of the environment than the attacker, or the defender will have a better knowledge of the technology that the attacker is attempting to exploit. What this then will require is the attacker to then escalate their level of effort in order to bypass these very rigorous controls in order to continue on with their attack. Obviously, escalation of effort will typically directly be related to either time or money or both. Now, while this is absolutely a benefit, there are also difficulties associated with this method of threat hunting. Namely, attackers still only need to find a single point of failure in order to be successful. So no matter how good your controls are, once they're bypassed, again, the attacker can continue on with the attack. So what this really requires is the attacker only to escalate their level of effort at certain points or certain phases of the attack. And it's really simply just tightening your perimeter defenses to, again, shore them up, but still, you're just simply reducing the radius of attack. And once the citadel is compromised, the attacker then can continue on, and the crown jewels are left vulnerable at that point. Now, we're all aware of the issues with perimeter-based defenses, and even with the best detection choke points, there's always a hole, right? In 2001, the SANS Institute states that despite the strongest perimeter, a script kiddie will sometimes find a method to successfully attack a network. In 2013, Rob Joyce, the head of the NSA's Tailored Access Operations Unit, said that with any large network, I tell you that persistence and focus will get you in and will achieve that exploitation without 0 days. So yes, obviously we can pop a 0 day and evade our focus threat detection choke points. But what's being stated here is that even without a 0 day, we can still, with enough time and resources, we can find a way to evade detection choke points. And so again, it brings us back to the age-old issue of perimeter-based security. And even when we tighten that perimeter, reduce radius of attack, we are still vulnerable, exposed without the concept of layered defenses or detections in place. Now that we've discussed just what threat hunting is and how it's implemented across the industry, I want to move on and discuss my research. As I began to craft my data analysis plan, I realized that threat research up to this point has largely focused on efforts to dissect, formalize, and model the cyber attack lifecycle through theories like the kill chain. However, I quickly realized that a research gap existed when it came to the strategic application of these models in a formalized, practical attack detection methodology. And so my data analysis plan then became a set of procedures that I could use to collect and then analyze security metrics with the purpose of aligning the kill chain to contemporary threat hunting activities that were being used in industry. And what I hypothesized was that this data and the subsequent analysis would then reveal detection gaps relative to the phases of the attack lifecycle. And so then these holes would then reveal the need for a formal threat hunting methodology that would actually provide comprehensive attack detection across all phases of the kill chain. I also hypothesized that when an organization's detection strategy is actually aligned to each phase of the kill chain, the opportunity for attack detection is increased by as much as 700%. So my data collection procedures were as followed. I went ahead and created a survey in the Qualtrics research platform and then distributed the survey via email to the Penn State faculty as well as the graduate student body. Many of these are working professionals in the IT industry and other professional industries. Additionally, I distributed this on LinkedIn where I had around or just under 2,000 connections, and then Twitter, which was another several hundred connections as well. I'd hoped that I'd be able to receive 100 plus responses. However, given that I was constrained by my time frame to only the month of March, I was able to collect 80 responses for my survey. After I'd received the results from my survey, I was able to then begin to analyze the data. My first task was to break this data out by demographics. So I chose 3 key indicators. Number 1, industry category, organizational size, and perceived organizational security maturity. My survey contained questions such as, does your organization have a hunt team? What common security controls are in use? What security frameworks influence threat detection efforts? Please prioritize the phase of the kill chain. And please identify specific focus areas and techniques critical to threat hunting. After collecting this data and reviewing the demographic breakdowns, I was ready to begin my analysis. As I initially began to analyze this data, I wanted to first understand the demographics that made up these surveys. And so I noted that the federal government and healthcare were the 2 highest participants at 16.25% each, and defense and financial services were the next highest at 11.25% of my responses. After determining the demographic makeup of the survey responses, I wanted to take it a step further and determine which industry sectors had the highest perceived security maturity. And it was interesting to note that state and local government, as well as the entertainment industry, both scored themselves as 9s out of 10s. Interestingly enough, defense and energy actually scored themselves a touch lower, just below 9, 8.89 and 8.67 respectively. And construction and manufacturing scored themselves actually at the lowest maturity levels of a 0 and a 2 respectively. Now, not surprising, but the overall average security maturity across the entire sample set was a touch below 7, right? It's a 6.92 out of 10. So it was, almost a C. We could improve, but we're not too bad as an average when it came to perceived security maturity there. Another metric that I was interested in was the stated security maturity against organizational size. I was wondering if a smaller or a larger organization might impact the perceived security maturity. And what I found is that organizational size didn't really have a considerable impact on perceived security maturity, except when organizations were over 10,000 employees, in which case we did see a slight spike up in the actual perceived security maturity of the organization. A metric of particular interest to me was actually the prevalence of certain security controls across the different environments of those being surveyed. So, not surprisingly, but we saw antivirus and firewalls tied for number one at 81.5%. I would assume that the only reason that these are not higher is either people misread the question or didn't want to admit to any information at all. Email filtering was a close second at 77.8%. Now, the least prevalent security controls were ones that obviously demonstrated a much higher level of technical expertise. So it'd be in-house forensics and reverse engineering, next generation AV. Those would be under about just touch under 30% of those who responded admit to these capabilities. And MSSP support was actually at the very bottom of the list at 15%. One thing to note is the most prevalent controls do reflect back to what we talked about earlier as far as kind of those traditional IDS and IPSs out there that rely on the static indicators. And we did discuss the inherent risks associated with relying upon these sort of controls as the primary means for detection in an environment. I then began to analyze some of the other correlations in this data that I collected. So I began to look at the average number of controls by organizational size. It was interesting to note that medium-sized businesses, as well as small-sized businesses, had considerably more tools than larger businesses. On average, it was between a little over 16 and almost 18 controls per business unit. And it was assumed that these smaller businesses required additional automation to make up for the lack of personnel. I then began to correlate these average number of controls by the actual industry verticals that were represented in the survey. And no surprise here, financial services, defense, and energy topped the list with the most controls, whereas construction was at the bottom of the list with 4 controls, and education and manufacturing only were known to have 5 controls each. My next step was to take this data regarding the average number of controls, and I wanted to contrast it against the stated or perceived maturity of that organization. So it wasn't a surprise to see that organizations with a stated maturity rating of 0 and 1 had relatively few security controls or tools in place. Now, there was an interesting spike with organizations that had a security maturity rating of 3. Actually, in this case, these organizations had 23 out of 24 of the controls that were surveyed. I can only assume that they were probably overwhelmed by the significant number of different controls in place, and just managing them was a nightmare, and there was some immaturity there. Organizations with a maturity level of 4 had an average of 12 controls, and then it was interesting that we noticed sort of a normalization occur, that all organizations with a maturity level greater than 5 sort of averaged out right around 15 unique security controls per organization. The next item that I wanted to analyze was actually the use of threat hunting broken out by these various demographic categories. So you can see in the first chart, I have the use of threat hunting broken out by the organizational size. And you can see as obviously organizations grew bigger, the use of threat hunting became more prevalent. The same was the case when I contrasted the use of threat hunting against perceived organizational maturity. Now, it is interesting to see that this trend increases up to 9, then all of a sudden at 10 it seems to drop down a little bit. Um, I believe this was simply because at such a high maturity level, these organizations prefer not to disclose that information. It's also interesting, I have listed below again the demographic data broken out by industry sector regarding the sectors that use threat hunting the most. And again, you can see defense, financial services, government, healthcare, as well as IT, and then there's other undisclosed as well as sort of the predominant uh, players that are leveraging threat hunting in some capacity. After collecting and then categorizing this data according to the various demographic groups, I was ready then to synthesize this information with my research into threat hunting and the various security models associated with this practice. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, a goal of mine has been to assist organizations as they look to mature their threat hunting capabilities. In 2017, Dr. Eric Cole of the SANS Institute provided a 5-phased approach to accomplishing just this. Number 1, he states we need to build threat hunting on a solid and realistic understanding of how the adversary works and operates. This is where threat models such as the kill chain are essential to build that foundation for our threat hunting operations. Number 2, we need to start with published indicators of compromise with the goal of moving towards detecting advanced attacks via anomalies and correlation of behavior. So we're starting at the bottom of the pyramid of pain and moving up to those more behavioral TDPs at the very top of the pyramid of pain while we're using statistical analysis to help tune out false positives and eliminate that noise. Number 3, we need to adapt and adjust to the unique needs of your environment. We need to have subject matter experts in place to be able to monitor those high value targets as well as at certain critical control points for us to set up those detection choke points. Moving on, we need to then investigate and understand and reutilize useful threat data discovered during the hunts. This is where lessons learned is such a valuable component of how threat intelligence is then reincorporated back into our environment and our controls. And then finally, at the last stage of maturation, we need to be able to create metrics such as dwell time to track the overall progress and maturity of our threat hunting efforts. And again, it almost refers back to number 1 when we talk about the importance of having a comprehensive model that we can then use as the basis for these metrics. Dr. Cole had good reason to provide the 5 steps for maturing threat operations on the previous page, as he noticed that while many organizations are performing threat hunting, it is often an ad hoc process with no formal methods or procedures. In my own research, I was quite fascinated when I began to look at the use of threat hunting and threat modeling for detection. Of those I surveyed, only half of them were currently using threat hunting in their environment. Of that subset, only 50% actually align threat hunting activities to a security model or a framework. So of the entire population, only 25% of those surveyed actually were using threat hunting that was aligned to a security model or a framework. In my research, I studied a number of threat detection models. The Lockheed Martin Kill Chain was first introduced in 2010 in a white paper titled Intelligence-Driven Computer Network Defense Informed by Analysis of Adversary Campaigns and Intrusion Kill Chains. The phrase kill chain actually describes the structure of an intrusion, and the corresponding model guides analysis to inform actionable security intelligence. It was stated in this paper that advanced persistent threats, or APTs, have rendered conventional network defenses insufficient. The Lockheed Martin Kill Chain is comprised of 7 phases used to model the attack lifecycle. In phase 1, an attacker performs reconnaissance on their target. This intelligence then is used in phase 2 during the weaponization phase to create a payload. The payload is then delivered to the target, at which point it will then detonate during the exploitation phase.
Installation will then commence as the attacker begins to entrench themselves on that particular system. You'll see things such as persistence being established, credentials being dumped, or privilege escalation occurring, as well as obfuscation. Next, you'll see the attacker phone home, usually during the command and control phase, to determine what should occur next. After this beacon, typically you'll see the actions and objectives phase take place. It's during this phase where we'll see data exfiltration or data theft or some form of destruction occurring in the environment. Now, it's stated in the white paper that the kill chain analysis illustrates that the adversary must progress successfully through each phase of the kill chain before it can achieve its desired objective. Just one mitigation disrupts the kill chain and the adversary. Through intelligence-driven response, the defender can achieve an advantage over the aggressor for APT caliber adversaries. While I gained significant inspiration from the Lockheed Martin Kill Chain, I noted that other models emphasize certain nuances of attacker behavior. The Mandiant attack lifecycle model was one of these. In 2010, Mandiant published the now infamous APT-1 report. In this report, they noted that recursion occurs in the attack lifecycle during the lateral movement phase. This was an interesting adaptation of the waterfall model of the Lockheed Martin Kill Chain. As I mentioned earlier, the concept of defense in depth began to come into play here. I began to wonder if the concept of attackers not being able to begin an attack or devise an attack against inner defenses until they breach outer defenses could be applied to detection within a security model. While traditionally defense in depth is applied at the architectural level to defend the various layers of the OSI model, I began to wonder if defense in depth methodology could be applied across all phases of an attack framework to prevent the dangers associated with clustering detection controls along a perimeter. With this now as context, I began to develop my standard for strategic threat hunting and detection. The goal of my project was to define a standard for strategic threat hunting and detection that would result in a quantifiable improvement in threat hunting effectiveness. By implementing a threat detection model aligned to the phases of the kill chain, those defending the environment have up to 7 times the opportunities to detect malicious activity throughout the attack lifecycle. This quantifiable increase in detection awareness impacts an adversary's operational difficulty, thereby coercing attackers to escalate their level of effort to avoid detection. I wasn't done yet, however. I was intrigued by the recursive nature of the Mandiant attack lifecycle. I want to see if there is a way to incorporate this into the kill chain. As I began to explore the kill chain in detail, I noticed that there was actually a logical decision point right at command and control. At command and control, an adversary can either determine that they've reached the end of their objective and then they're able to then proceed with the actual exfiltration and theft of data or destruction of data, or they can actually move laterally and begin to spider through the network at this point. Now, what I began to realize is that at the command and control phase, if the decision fork was made to move laterally through the network, the kill chain actually reset at that point. So then the attacker, once they're on the new system, begins to perform reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and again, they've reached that decision point. Now, the reason I bring this up is this is key to threat hunting. The attacker's progression through the various phases of the kill chain will look very different whether they're a new attack or an entrenched adversary already living off the land. What I mean by this is this. In the first iteration of the newly recursive kill chain, an attacker's trying to form that initial incursion into the environment. Typically, this would be done through spear phishing, some sort of USB key dropped in a parking lot. It would be potentially rather noisy, and it'll be, again, external going to the inside. However, once inside the environment, the attacker will then behave just like a malicious insider would, right? So they will, instead of having to necessarily spearfish their way in, they'll be able to live off the land and maybe leverage a service account or move laterally through the network via shared drives. And so, as a threat hunter, you need to be aware of these different ways in which an attacker can incur your environment and then remain in your environment. And so, you're looking for both new attackers trying to go from the outside in or malicious activity that's already spiraling inside your environment and recursing through the kill chain as they are moving ultimately to their ultimate objective to complete the attack progression. With this newly adapted model of the kill chain in mind, I began to revisit the data from my survey. Previously, I had asked the respondents to provide, on a scale from 0 to 10, the visibility they had into each phase of the kill chain. You can see the results in the spider graph here. It's interesting to note that weaponization and reconnaissance scored lower than all other phases of the kill chain when it came to visibility by at least 20 to 30%. Now, this is interesting because now that we have this recursive model of the kill chain, we should have more opportunities to gain visibility as this activity would be occurring inside our environment in the case of an established attacker. So we should, for instance, be able to see reconnaissance occurring maybe with sysinternals tools being run in the environment, or an attacker trying to run task list or who am I on a system. We would also maybe be able to see weaponization occurring, whether it be through polymorphic code or fileless attacks executing on the endpoints themselves. Additionally, I further went on to ask each participant to provide the perceived value for each phase of the kill chain when it came to detection. I asked them to rate this again from 0 to 10. It's interesting to note that indicators gained in each phase of the kill chain were identified as being progressively more valuable than those in the prior phases. As you can see from the diagram below, again, there's a lopsided skew here away from reconnaissance and weaponization and delivery, and you can see that the value slowly stretches out towards the end of the kill chain. Well, this lopsided perception of value for each of the phases of the kill chain then represents a significant value and opportunity for an attacker to avoid detection in the early phases of the kill chain. Ultimately, what we are talking about here are the economies of target value versus level of effort. As threat hunters, our goal is to coerce attackers to escalate their levels of effort, time, and money to a point at which it becomes too costly for them based upon the perceived value of the target. Is it really worth an attacker to have to burn multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, on 0 days for them to evade detection at every single phase of the kill chain? In addition to the financial cost associated with using a 0 day, the loss of intellectual capital is enormous. If intruders deploy a 0 day exploit but reuse observable tools or infrastructure in other phases, that major improvement is fruitless if their defenders have mitigations for the repeated indicators. It is at this point that I want to introduce you to my model for comprehensive threat hunting. This includes the concept of fuzzy detection. The argument made by my paper proposes that sufficiently broad monitoring across all phases of the kill chain, defense and depth, is substantially more effective than ad hoc or singularly deep monitoring across a select few phases of the kill chain. We've discussed before about the vulnerabilities related to reducing the radius of attack or perimeter detection, where there's still a single point of failure, versus a series of redundant detection choke points at all phases of the kill chain. This redundancy provides detection of partial 0 day attacks due to TTP reuse. Forensics on these detected attacks then generate additional cyber threat intelligence, forcing attackers to completely reinnovate their TTPs from the beginning. By applying the theory of defense in depth to detection in depth across a comprehensive threat model such as the kill chain, an organization can ensure that detection is holistically implemented throughout the entire attack lifecycle. This also has the added benefit of allowing security management to strategically align threat hunting operations against the kill chain, and then we can audit against these to measure for tactical gaps in comprehensive detection.
In summary, we have compared 3 strategies for threat hunting in this presentation. First, I reviewed threat hunting based upon threat intelligence. It was shown that this process was merely an extension of ad-hoc searching as opposed to a formal, comprehensive search strategy, and that this simply relies on the premise that the more indicators you have, hopefully the better chance you'll have at detecting malicious activity. However, given the significant variance in the comprehensivity, speed of delivery, and robustness of indicators, this strategy was only somewhat effective when it came to detecting known attack vectors. It is also very important to note that when it came to the detection of new attack vectors, this method of threat hunting was shown to be ineffective. Next, we reviewed focused threat operations, or the use of detection choke points from leveraging singularly deep detections with highly focused, highly trained, highly knowledgeable staff. While this method proved to be very effective at certain points in the kill chain, ultimately it was determined that this was simply a tightening of the detection perimeter or reducing the radius of attack as while you have very robust levels of detection at certain points in the kill chain, once the attacker bypassed these detection choke points, it then was relatively easy for the attacker to continue on with their attack, thus leaving the high value targets exposed once the attacker managed to penetrate your detection barrier point. Lastly, I propose a strategy of detection and breadth based upon a recursive adaptation of the kill chain. This strategy is based on the idea of a redundant series of detections implemented at every phase of the kill chain. With this approach, even if an attacker manages to evade detection at certain points in the kill chain, defenders still have multiple opportunities to detect and stop an intrusion. Essentially, this is an implementation of defense in depth across the attacker lifecycle. It should be noted that this strategy is implemented using an improved kill chain model. This new model now enables threat hunters to evolve in their detection capabilities to detect both new attempts to breach an environment as well as entrenched adversaries moving laterally through the network. Another way to look at this novel approach to threat hunting is to consider the differences in how current threat hunting strategies might be used to secure a physical location like a bank vault. One could randomly place laser tripwires inside the bank, thus providing an ad hoc detection barrier with the idea that the more tripwires you have, the more opportunities that an intruder might set them off. However, without strategically placing these sensors, detection gaps would be sure to abound. A focused threat operations approach would probably hire a team of expert consultants to install a laser mesh at the entrance to the bank and across the door to the vault in order to provide a tight security grid to protect high-value assets. However, if an intruder was able to bypass these sensors, the contents inside the bank would be left vulnerable. In this case, a burglar would only need to escalate their level of effort during certain phases of the robbery. However, using the detection and breadth approach, one would first analyze the process an attacker would enter and rob the bank. After this, they would then place laser tripwires at each of the strategic points the thief would need to bypass. This might include placing lasers at the entrance to the bank, along the foyer, at the teller counter, across the hallways leading to the vault, at the entrance to the vault, inside the vault, and then across the windows and other exits. Even if a thief were able to bypass one or multiple tripwires, additional detections further down the path would provide additional opportunities to detect a robbery. In this manner, the burglar would need to remain on high alert during the entire course of the robbery. If they made a mistake at even just one point, no matter how close they were to their objective, the alarms would go off and they would be detected. It is in this manner that one can ensure comprehensive and redundant coverage across all 7 phases of the kill chain. When threat hunting is aligned to the strategy of detection and breadth, defenders are able to achieve up to 700% increased detection awareness over the current ad hoc and focused threat detection strategies. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my findings. I'd love to get your feedback. If you'd like, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn address is shown below, which is linkedin.com/in/Ben Tedesco. Or feel free to follow my Twitter handle, @AParanoidGenius. Thank you, and best of luck in your threat hunting endeavors.